Have you ever sat at a holiday table and realized you were the only one there who still believed it was a family? Have you ever stayed quiet for so long that people started mistaking your patience for permission? That Thanksgiving night, in my grandfather's limestone house outside Fredericksburg, I learned exactly what happens when cruelty gets too comfortable. I used to believe that if I kept the peace, if I swallowed every insult and smiled through every small humiliation, then my daughter would still have a place in this family. I told myself endurance was a kind of protection. I told myself I could carry the weight of my sister Brianna's sharp tongue and my Aunt Patricia's polished indifference if it meant 12-year-old Emma would stay secure under the family trust her father worked so hard to preserve. I was wrong. By then, I was a widow, raising one extraordinary little girl, with more courage than most adults I know. Emma lived with a serious spinal and neurological condition, and the wheelchair she used was not a symbol, not a prop, and certainly not a weakness. It was custom-built for her, shaped around her body, with design notes her father had worked on before he passed. Every inch of it carried his love. That night, the dining room looked beautiful, in the way expensive things often do when there is no warmth behind them. The chandelier spilled too much gold over the table. The air smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, and red wine. Silverware clinked softly against china. Everything shimmered, but none of it felt gentle. The room felt like a stage, and every smile around that table looked rehearsed. Brianna had been drinking just enough to become crueler than usual. She leaned back in her chair, studied Emma for a long second, then stood up so suddenly the room went still. She pointed straight at my daughter and said, "We all know she's playing this up." Before I could speak, her son Mason let out a laugh and grabbed Emma's wheelchair by the handle. He yanked it back hard, rolling it away from the table and toward the dark hallway. "Come on," he said with a smirk. "Just stand up and walk." Emma gasped and reached into empty space, her fingers trembling as the chair rolled farther from her reach. I heard one wheel strike the baseboard with a dull crack. A wine glass tipped over. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like a fresh wound. Patricia frowned. Not at Mason, not at Brianna, but at the mess. Ronald stared down at his plate as if silence could make him invisible. And me? I did not cry. I did not scream. Somewhere between Emma's shaking hand and that awful sound of the wheelchair hitting the wall, I felt something inside me go still. My compassion had been overdrawn for years. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and unlocked it with steady hands. I wasn't calling family. I was calling the one person in that room they would never be able to talk over. I set the phone down in the center of that perfect white table like I was placing evidence into open view, and for the first time all night, nobody moved. The screen lit up, and Dr. Elise Harper appeared from her office, calm and composed in a way that made the whole room feel suddenly smaller. Her face was professional, unreadable, the kind of face that did not bend for family politics or holiday performance. I angled the phone so everyone could see her clearly, then I looked straight at Brianna and said, "Since this family has spent the last several months questioning every medical expense connected to Emma's care, I thought it would be helpful for you to hear the facts from the specialist herself." Brianna gave a short laugh and leaned back in her chair, still trying to wear confidence like it belonged to her. "Oh, come on, Lauren," she said. "You're seriously calling a doctor during Thanksgiving dinner? This is exactly the kind of spectacle I'm talking about." But Dr. Elise did not flinch. Her voice came through the speakers low, clean, and cold enough to cut through every false smile in that room. "This is not a spectacle," she said. "Emma's condition is real, medically documented, and not open to opinion." The room went so quiet I could hear the low hum of the air conditioner and the faint rattle of silver against one of the china plates. "Doctor," Elise continued, The chair that was just removed is a custom mobility device. It was built to support Emma's spinal alignment, reduce neurological strain, and lower her risk of injury. It is not optional equipment. Then she paused and said, "Lauren, turn the camera toward the hallway." I did. The phone moved slowly in my hand, and there it was, Emma's chair sitting too far away under the dim light near the wall, out of reach from where she sat at the table. Emma was trying so hard to stay composed, but I could see her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles pale, her breathing shallow. Mason still had half a smile on his face, the kind boys wear when they think they are untouchable. Then, Dr. Elise spoke again. "If that child attempts to move without that device and falls, this becomes more than cruelty. It becomes a documented safety concern involving a minor." Mason's face changed first. Not dramatically, just enough. The smugness drained out of him. Patricia lowered her eyes to the wine stain on the tablecloth, as if it were suddenly more interesting than the truth. Brianna's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. Dr. Elise did not raise her voice, she did not need to. "Let me be very clear," she said. "This does not end with an apology if Emma is harmed. It becomes a formal matter." Nobody touched their food after that. The knives and forks had gone still. The room that had felt overheated under the chandelier now felt chilled straight through. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. What I felt was sharper than that, a kind of icy clarity settling into my chest. This was no longer a strained family dinner. This was the moment the masks began to fall. And as I looked at Emma, still reaching for steadiness in a room full of people who had failed her, I remembered something my grandmother Rosemary used to say. "A legacy is not what you keep for yourself. It is who you refuse to let the world break." All those years, I had mistaken my silence for sacrifice. That night, I finally understood that to them, my silence had only ever been permission. That should have been the moment things stopped, but families like mine never surrender control when the truth finally enters the room. They just change tactics. By sunrise the next morning, I was standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hands, staring at my phone, while the first light spread pale across the counters. And I could already feel the counterattack gathering speed. But none of it had started that morning. Not really. It had started years earlier, in a house where Brianna was always described as bold, spirited, impossible to contain, while I was taught that love meant absorbing damage quietly. Growing up, she had a talent for finding the exact thing that mattered to me and putting her heel on it. When I was 15, she accidentally knocked over the dress I had laid out for an academic awards banquet, leaving a dark stain across the front and smiling as if it were nothing. When I got into a summer program on scholarship, she made sure half the school heard it in the ugliest way possible, like needing help was something shameful. Every time Patricia would tilt her head, sigh like I was exhausting her, and say, "Lauren, don't be so sensitive. That's just Brianna's strong personality." Strong personality. That was the phrase they used when cruelty wore lipstick and knew how to smile in public. So, I learned to swallow things whole. I learned how to go quiet in self-defense. And when my husband died, and Emma's care became the center of my life, I stayed even quieter, because the family land trust was tied to her future, to her treatment, to the stability I couldn't afford to lose. While Brianna played the role of polished success in tailored boots and luxury listings, I was the one handling the practical weight of the family holdings. I knew the water reports, the fencing repairs, the tax notices, the grazing schedules, the things that kept land alive when image meant nothing. Brianna collected attention. I carried responsibility. By the next morning, she had already turned that difference into a weapon. She posted on the local community board first, then in 2 private groups, hinting that I had staged the entire Thanksgiving scene, to pressure the family into releasing more trust money. She didn't say Emma was faking in those exact words this time. She was cleverer than that. She used phrases like dramatic manipulation and emotional performance, the kind of language that lets a lie walk around dressed like concern. I scrolled through the comments with a numb feeling rising in my chest. One person wondered whether I had used a medical professional to create sympathy. Another called Emma's chair a prop. What nearly took the breath out of me was seeing a woman I had once helped during a hard winter freeze tap that little heart beneath Brianna's post. I stared at that screen until the words blurred. Then Patricia called. Her voice held none of the softness she performed in public. It was clipped, cold, managerial. "You need to fix this today," she said. "You will post a statement saying Dr. Harper misunderstood the situation, and you will stop feeding gossip before this damages the family permanently." I said nothing, and she pressed harder. "If you refuse, Ronald will remove you from Walter's estate management team. Do you understand me?" Then she crossed the line she always seemed determined to find. She said Emma was becoming dependent because I encouraged weakness. She said I was turning my daughter into a symbol people would pity because pity was easier to leverage than dignity. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then a strange calm settled over me. I understood something I should have understood years earlier. Explaining myself had never been changing their minds. It had only been proof that they still had the power to put me on trial. That morning, I decided I was done standing in that courtroom. I did not argue. I did not defend. After Patricia hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, looked out at the dry Texas light stretching across the pasture, and called Nathan Cole, the attorney who had handled my husband's estate when my whole world first split open. My voice was steady when he answered. I told him I needed a formal records request and a full audit of the trust. That night, I wasn't searching for the right words to clear my name. I was looking for someone who knew how to open a door they had been hiding behind for years. After I got off the phone with Nathan, something inside me settled into place, and a few days later I drove out to the main house, knowing I was no longer showing up as a niece asking to be treated fairly. I was arriving as someone prepared to document everything. The morning was cold in that dry Central Texas way, with a pale gray light stretched thin over the pasture and a hard wind pushing dust across the gravel drive. My tires crunched slowly as I pulled up to the old limestone house, and for a second I just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The porch swing moved faintly in the breeze. One loose hinge on the screen door gave a tired metallic creak. It was the same house I had entered 1,000 times as family, but that morning it felt like a building full of records, secrets, and locks. Ronald was on the front porch with a coffee mug in one hand, looking out over the land the way men do when they want to appear calm in places they think belong to them. When he saw me coming up the steps, his mouth curled into that dismissive half-smile I had known for years. I handed him the envelope. "What is this?" he asked, already annoyed. "A formal demand for records," I said. "Nathan Cole is initiating a full audit of the land trust, the medical trust, and every land transaction from the last 5 years. Ronald gave a short laugh, but it landed wrong. "Lauren, don't do this," he said. "You're upset. That's understandable. But once you start something like this, you can't walk it back." I looked straight at him and answered evenly. "I'm not here to walk anything back. I'm here to inform you that as a primary beneficiary and lawful co-manager, I am requesting complete documentation. You have 14 days. After that, the records will be compelled." He tried to swing the door shut then, like ending the conversation with force could still restore his authority, but I stopped it with one sentence. "If that door closes before I'm finished, the next knock will come with legal service." That froze him. For the first time, he looked less offended than uncertain. Behind him, I heard movement inside the house, And a second later, Brianna stepped onto the porch. She still had that polished look, but something in her face had shifted. It was small, but I saw it. Confusion. Maybe even fear. The audit did not take long to uncover what my instincts had been warning me about for years. When Nathan laid the documents out in front of me, page after page, it was worse than negligence and far beyond sloppy bookkeeping. It was a coordinated system. Over the previous several years, 72 acres of the South pasture, land that had long been marked for Emma's future, had been sold without my knowledge. To authorize that transfer, my signature had been required. There was a signature on the deed. It just was not mine. Nathan had already brought in a handwriting expert. The report was clear. The signature had been forged. The notary seal came back to Calvin Reed, an old college friend of Brianna's, and once that name surfaced, more pieces fell into place. The title insurance company had already flagged irregularities in the transfer file. Then Nathan showed me an internal email chain, one Brianna clearly never expected anyone outside her circle to see, pushing for the paperwork to be finalized fast before Lauren starts asking questions. I remember staring at that line and feeling no outward reaction at all. The money trail was just as ugly. $348,000 had been routed through shell accounts, then split off where it was most useful to them. Part of it went into Brianna's struggling luxury real estate business in Austin. Another portion helped cover Mason's $58,000 annual tuition. They had not just drained money, they had converted Emma's inheritance into image, access, and appearances. By then, I was no longer shaking. I was no longer angry in the loud, emotional way they were probably expecting. I felt cold, focused, almost clinical, like I was reading an autopsy report on something that had been dying for a long time. I waited until Nathan finished, then I gave him the only instruction that mattered. "Send everything to Grandfather Walter," I said. "And send a full copy to the district attorney." From that moment on, they were no longer family members behaving badly. They were names in a file. Once their names became part of a file, the ending was never going to happen at the dinner table. It was going to happen somewhere quieter, colder, and far more final. The meeting took place 3 days later in Nathan's office, in a conference room lined with dark wood shelves and framed legal certificates that seemed to watch everything without blinking. The air smelled like paper, old leather, and coffee that had been poured too early and left to cool untouched. A clock on the wall ticked with such sharp, measured patience that it sounded louder than anyone's breathing. Grandfather Walter sat at the head of the table with his cane resting beside him, his back straight, his expression carved from the same hard old discipline that had built the family holdings in the first place. Nathan sat to his right, with the files neatly stacked in front of him. Dr. Elise was there too, calm and composed, a witness not only to Emma's medical reality, but to the carelessness with which that reality had been mocked. I sat across from them, hands folded, pulse steady. Patricia and Brianna came in together, dressed beautifully, carrying the brittle confidence of women who had talked themselves into believing status could still save them. Ronald arrived last. He tried to look composed, but there was a tightness around his mouth I had never seen before. Patricia opened first, of course. She leaned forward, softened her voice, and tried to dress control up as concern. "Lauren, this has gone far enough," she said. "We are still family. Dragging this through legal channels is not protection, it is destruction." Brianna picked up the thread immediately, her voice already beginning to fray. She said they had only made difficult decisions to keep the property stable, to protect the land, to keep everything from collapsing. But then Nathan opened the file and began placing the truth on the table piece by piece, the forged signature analysis, the land transfer on the 72 acres, the routing records for the shell accounts, the questionable notarization tied to Calvin Reed, the flagged title review, the internal email urging the sale through before I could find out. When Brianna saw that printed email with her own words staring back at her, the pen in her hand slipped and hit the table with a hard little click that sounded much louder than it should have. Patricia turned on Ronald instantly. "You told me this was handled," she snapped, and just like that, the polished front they had held together for years cracked right down the middle. No one had to expose them emotionally, they were doing that themselves. Nathan finished speaking, and the room fell still. For a long second, all anyone could hear was that clock and the faint hum of the building's air system. Then I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them anger, because anger would have let them pretend this was personal. "You did not protect this family," I said. "You protected appearances. You took land meant for Emma's future, funds meant for her care, and used them to support your lifestyle, your image, and your comfort. That was never stewardship. That was theft dressed up as family business." Brianna's face twisted first into disbelief, then fury. She pointed at me and said I was tearing everyone apart, that I had turned grandfather Walter against them. But Walter did not even look at her when he answered. "No," he said quietly, "you did that yourselves." Then he reached for the documents Nathan had prepared, and signed them with a hand that did not tremble once. Patricia and Ronald were removed from all co-management authority effective immediately. Full control of the land trust and the medical trust, now totaling $10,870,460, was transferred to me. Walter then gave one final instruction in the same tone some men used to discuss weather. The locks on the main house would be changed that evening. Patricia, Ronald, and Brianna would have 48 hours to remove their personal belongings under private security supervision. After that, anything left behind would be professionally stored at their expense. Brianna started shouting then, but her voice sounded different now, thin where it used to sound sharp. Nobody rushed to calm her, nobody defended her. For the first time in my life, her outrage had nowhere to land. Emma and I moved a week later into the smaller sunlit house on the quietest hill on the property. It was not grand, but it felt honest. The mornings were soft there. The wind moved through the grass instead of through people. Emma started breathing easier. She smiled more. Her body seemed to loosen in a place where she no longer had to brace herself against judgment. In time, I established the Rosemary Fund, named for the woman who had understood before anyone else that legacy means very little if it does not protect the vulnerable. The fund now helps children with conditions people too often dismiss or misunderstand, providing long-term care, adaptive equipment, and practical support without shame. I used to think losing family was the worst thing that could happen to a person. Now I know something worse. Staying in a place so cruel that your child begins to feel like she has to apologize for her own body. Not every table deserves your seat. Sometimes dignity begins the moment you stop begging to be included.